Welcome to today's virtual Hinckley Forum. The Hinckley Institute of Politics is a nonpartisan institute at the University of Utah. The Hinckley provides an array of transformative experiences for students through internships, forums, and classes. Hinckley Forums seek to foster public discourse and civil debate on the most current and pressing issues, bringing in local, national, and international thought leaders. Today's forum is presented in partnership with the Political Science Department at the University of Utah. We would like to thank our media sponsor, KCPW, for recording and rebroadcasting our forums as part of the Hinckley Radio Hour. Today's forum is the past, present, and future of the Electoral College. Our panelists for today's forum will be Jim Curry, Associate Professor for the Political Science Department, Peter Greathouse, 2016 Elector for the state of Utah, Pat Rosensteel, Senior Advisor for National Popular Vote, and our moderator, Scott Howell, former Utah State Senate Minority Leader, Utah surrogate for the Biden-Harris moderator, Scott Howell.
Great, thank you, Ann. I really appreciate that introduction, and thank you to our panel. We appreciate all of you being here. And why don't we just jump right into it? And let's start with you, if it's okay, Jim, or Professor, I should say. What exactly is the Electoral College? I mean, what is this thing? People go out and vote and they think, hey, I just voted and my neighbors voted and that person won. Why aren't they winning and why aren't they listening to them? Tell us what the Electoral College really is.
Yeah, let me try to make it sort of a brief overview. In my courses, I'll spend an entire day or two just sort of giving an overview of the Electoral College. So I'll try to keep this short and sweet. But I mean, in essence, the Electoral College is our unusual and multi-step process of electing the president with voters. Rather than voters choosing the president, we have this process of selecting slates of electors by state into what's called the Electoral College, who then cast votes for the president and vice president, which are then counted and certified by the U.S. Congress. States are apportioned a certain number of electors for the college every 10 years after the decennial census. The apportionment is semi-proportional to each state's relative population in the union. Each state receives a number of votes that's equal to its number of seats in the House of Representatives, plus 2, essentially reflecting the number of senators for each state. And this skews the college slightly towards smaller population states and also ensures that there's always going to be something of a disconnect between the popular vote and the Electoral College. When you and I go and vote on election day in November, instead of choosing the president, we're actually choosing electors that will be certified in our state and become part of the college in December. And all but 2 states determine this outcome of a slate of electors as a winner-take-all approach, with Maine and Nebraska being the 2 that do it a little bit differently. Electors that we ultimately elect in November are not constitutionally bound to vote for their state's winner, which also happens to be the people that they pledge to vote for when they stand as electors. However, some states have statutes that enable them to punish what are called unfaithful electors, people who vote for someone other than who they pledged. But even so, an elector is still constitutionally capable of doing so if they're okay with the consequences. After people vote and the electors are chosen, the college casts its votes in state capitals around the country in mid-December. Congress then convenes in a joint session of Congress, as we all now know, on just January 6th to open the ballots, count them, and certify them. Congress can decertify ballots, and they have to ultimately count 270 votes for a person to become president and a person to become vice president. If they do not, if they end up with a count that's short of 270, the House then votes to select the president with 1 vote per state, and the Senate votes to select the vice president under a normal voting procedure. As I said, Congress can challenge the certification of electoral votes. We saw this in action on January 6th, and we've actually seen it in action in most of our elections since 2000. It requires that both the House and Senate member object in writing to the certification of votes from a state, and then each chamber debates and has to vote on whether or not to actually certify them or not. This has actually happened. They have thrown out votes before, though it's been a long time. And so that's just how long it took for me to give you like the bare bones overview of what the Electoral College is. Should tell you something about just how unusual of a system we happen to have.
So, Professor, I thought that was a great overview, and I think it helped our audience to understand more about the Electoral College. I have to ask you, if you were a fly on the wall back when the founders were developing and creating the Electoral College, what did they say in those conversations? What would you hear from them, and why did the founders even create the Electoral College? But what was the debate? Give us a flavor of what went on there.
So this was actually the aspect of the presidency that was maybe perhaps most debated, which was the question of how would we elect the president. The founders at the Constitutional Convention didn't spend a whole lot of time talking about most other aspects of the presidency. They mainly focused on, well, how are we going to pick this person?
Yeah.
And the Electoral College was ultimately the awkward result of a compromise among the delegates and various factions among them who wanted different things. Some delegates wanted a direct popular vote to elect the president. Some wanted Congress to elect the president. Some thought that state governments should do it. Interesting, the Electoral College, as all good compromises tend to turn out, involves all three and makes no one happy. People vote. Those votes are then reflected through an apportionment of the vote that reflects some of the founders' visions about state power with equal representation in the Senate for the states. And then the electors then vote, but Congress gets to be the final arbiter in deciding whether they count those ballots or do something else. In this way, it was a compromise that was good enough for the delegates to accept, but it was one in which nobody was really happy about. And their vision of how this would actually play out was very different than we had today. Most of the founders envisioned that this would be some sort of semi-deliberative body in which electors would be chosen from their states after perhaps being nominated by their state legislatures, and then they would meet and kind of actually discuss a little bit who they were going to cast ballots for. And it really only worked that way in 1788 and 1792. So we really have a system now that came out of an awkward compromise, not something that anybody really wanted or planned, but was good enough to get enough signatures to go forward, and has really turned into its own animal and its own political beast in its own right.
Professor, what would have been the conversation between Benjamin Franklin and some of those, and Jefferson? What would they said about this? What would their conversation be back and forth about this system?
Yeah, I mean, the ones who wanted more of a popular vote would maybe they'd be happier with where it is today, in that it's driven more by voters than they probably could have envisioned in the 1780s and the 1790s. But the ones who really wanted a direct popular vote didn't like the idea that there was much of a muzzle on the voters' choice. They wouldn't have liked, and they didn't like the idea that it wasn't proportional in terms of the number of votes coming out of each state. And they wouldn't necessarily have liked that they were giving Congress the ability to decertify votes and move forward. On the other hand, the folks who wanted the election of the president to be totally separate from the public, or at least a couple steps away, again, wouldn't have saw this as ideal either, because it has a voice, it has a process for the public. So many of those folks wanted the House of Representatives or the Senate to select the president, making it one or two steps away from voters themselves. So that's where the lines of debate really came down, is you had one side that was constantly agitating for more direct popular input and one side that wanted less popular input, and they essentially split the difference.
It's really interesting that you talk about that, Professor, because when I served in the state Senate, one of my colleagues one year ran a resolution that this would come back to the Senate to elect the president, and as well as our own U.S. Senator. And I was shocked to find that out, because I thought that was blasphemous in the democratic process. But it's interesting because we have an elector on the line with us today. Peter, how did you become an elector, and how many votes did you have to get to be the elector, and did you have to lobby people, and how much did it cost?
Well, Utah is a little different than some of the other states.
Sure.
Each political party gets to select its nominees for elector.
Mm-hmm.
And to do this, it's done at their state convention. And so if you want to run for elector, you file a letter of intent with your political party saying, I want to run. Since I'm a Republican, I filed with the Republican Party, and we have 4,000 state delegates. So I had to campaign with those 4,000 state delegates that I wanted to be I take that back. Since I was running for the position of elector in the 2nd Congressional District, I had a little over 1,000 people I had to campaign with. then we met at the state convention, and when they voted on all the other races, they also vote on who they want for the nominee for elector. There are 6 electors in Utah, 4 congressional, as was already mentioned, and 2 statewide. Only those delegates within the congressional district get to vote on those. All of them get to vote on statewide. So I only had to get the most votes of the people that were running. I believe there were about 5 people running when I did. So I had the most votes. At that time, it was substantial difference, but you do have to campaign with the state delegates. And then once again, you're not elected until presidential election.
So Peter, when you ran your campaign to become an elector, did you debate your opponents, and is it a popular vote, or how do you win that?
Well,
did you have to do some arm twisting out there?
No, I didn't do any arm twisting. I sent emails out to all the delegates, let them know my positions, but there wasn't any debate. I did provide people the opportunity to ask me questions. They could call me, email me, and I was open and upfront with them. Some of the people asked, why are we even bothering with this? And I had to explain to them why voting on elector was important. So,
yeah, it is. Well, tell us about the process after you were elector. What happened when the vote count came? I think we saw you on C-SPAN and CNN and everything else.
well, I don't know.
What happens on that process?
Well, after you're elected, you have one responsibility,
Uh-huh.
and only one responsibility. That's to show up on the day of the Electoral College when they meet, and you cast your vote. That's your only responsibility and your only duty. However, because it was an unusual year, a lot of emotion, in between the time that the presidential election and the casting of the electoral votes, I received thousands of letters, emails, phone calls, Facebook messages, overwhelmingly encouraging me not to vote the way I was committed to vote. And a lot of pressure applied. Also a couple threats made.
Really?
Yes.
Serious?
Yeah.
And in the sense of threats, were they worried that you wouldn't make who you said you'd vote for, or was it just that they were just
it was people upset with the outcome of the presidential election, trying to get me to vote for somebody other than Donald Trump.
But and I think the professor talked about that. Weren't you obligated under the Constitution to do that? And I think the professor was 2 states.
Under state law, we are obligated, we are bound to vote for whoever wins the vote in Utah. And our consequence for not following is immediate removal from the Electoral College. So if we had cast a vote otherwise, we would have been removed and somebody else would have been put in our stead to cast the vote properly. And there were questions about whether that was legal or not, but the Supreme Court just ruled on that in 2020, saying that it was legal and constitutional for the states to bind their electors.
Did your wife ever think, when you volunteered to do this, and it's a volunteer job, that you'd be threatened? And does that change your outlook on politics nowadays?
Well, I'm just glad I didn't have to do it this year when emotions were even higher.
Yeah.
And it does make me think about participating in things like this. When you receive those threats, you think mostly it's people trying to blow off steam.
Right.
But there's always that thought at the back of your head, what if?
Right.
And go on.
Oh, or threatening your family. I mean, I don't think any of us are in this business to expose our families.
Yeah.
Did
Yeah.
you have a background in politics, and what qualified you? I know there's a lot of students out there that might be interested now. Well, they might not now that we talked about the threat. Let's delete those comments. Let's go back and clean that up. No, they might be interested. Did you have a background in politics, and what is your profession?
Well, my profession is I'm a farmer and rancher. Live in a small community, a small county population-wise. So I've got a chance to be involved with the Republican Party here. First, I ran as a state delegate to represent my precinct.
Mm-hmm.
And I did that for 2 years. And then some people in the county decided I'd be good to serve as the county chairman for the Republican Party. So I served in that position for 5 terms, 5 2-year terms, so 10 years. And because of that, I served on the Republican Party state governing body, the State Central Committee. And so that's my experience with politics. I haven't held elected office. I don't even live in an incorporated town.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't have a lot of opportunities for elected office, but this was a way that I could step up and serve.
Well, that's terrific, and thank you for your service. And I'm going to imagine that would be the same process for the individuals on the call that might be of Democrat persuasion. And so what a great way to give back and to serve. So thank you. And we all appreciate, now that we're eating and we have food, we all appreciate your farming activities. Trust me, when we went to the stores, our family started to realize that manufacturing and producers really count nowadays. So, well, you know, on the call, it's interesting. We actually have Patrick Rosenstiel, and Patrick actually has a different viewpoint of the Electoral College. Patrick, tell us a little bit about your organization and some of the things that you've seen about the electoral system and some of the criticism. Introduce yourself to the audience and what organization you represent and why you think that popular vote is in there.
Well, yeah, I don't know how much I agree or disagree about the Electoral College, but my name is Pat Rosenstiel, and I'm senior consultant to National Popular Vote. We're an organization that's working on the Interstate Compact, and you know, oftentimes I think there's just way too much focus on the Electoral College. I think Professor Curry did a good job laying that out. I think if you had a conversation with the founders today, they certainly would not recognize the system we're using as the system they envisioned. I think the compromise is, you know, sort of an accurate portrayal of how they came out of the Constitutional Convention. But in their infinite wisdom, what they did is came up with, you know, 17 words that say each state shall appoint in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct a number of electors. So I think the biggest misconception around the Electoral College is that if you support the current, if you don't like the current system, that the Electoral College is the problem. The truth is, if you don't like the current system, the founders left it to the states to determine how they would change the way they award electors. And so what I've been working on for the better part of the last decade, or more than a decade, is the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact that asks the various state legislatures if they want to award their electors on the basis of the national popular vote. Because if you don't like the current system, you're not stuck with it. Our compact says that when states with 270 or more electoral votes, a majority of the Electoral College have our bill in place, they'll award their electors in block to the candidate who wins the most popular votes in all 50 states in the District of Columbia. And we think that's a much better use of electors for a majority of the states because, you know, right now, battleground state voters have all the political influence when we select the president, all of the influence with the president when he governs, and the rest of us, a Republican trapped behind the blue wall in Minnesota, exactly the same way as a Democrat might feel in Utah, we're absolutely ignored by these candidates as they campaign for the presidency. And, we simply believe we should have a system for electing the president where every voter in every state is politically relevant in every presidential election. We believe the principle of one person, one vote is foundational to the future of American democracy. And, we believe founders like Jefferson, who would do anything to make his home state of Virginia relevant, would probably side with us, because Virginia is now a flyover state like Minnesota is a flyover state. So at the end of the day, if you don't like the system we use, the state-based winner-take-all system, there's a very easy constitutional way to change it, which is to urge your legislature to adopt the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. It's the only way we'll have one in place by 2024. And we need everybody who believes we should be electing the president by national popular vote to get on board. And it's not a Republican or a Democrat idea. It's an American idea that enjoys bipartisan support because, look, the current system lends to chaos and doesn't protect small states. As a matter of fact, it marginalizes small states. It doesn't protect farmers and ranchers like Peter. To be honest with you, it leaves the Mountain West completely out of the mix when it comes to electing the president. So, that's my message today.
Boy, what a great message, Peter, and Patrick and Peter and James. And, a question that is asked all the time, and in fact, Molly and Ann had talked about this, and I want to start with you, James, on this question. What's the likelihood of the Electoral College reform? And is it real? Is what Patrick is doing? Is it something that might happen? Tell us about what your thoughts are on that. And then I want to go to you, Peter, and back to you, Patrick, to answer that same question.
Yeah, so on one hand, the Electoral College is not terribly popular with the American public. In most polls, at least 60% of Americans want at least some change to it, which is a pretty high number for an election system. It's most Americans, especially the more they learn about it, usually like it less. That said, there are some gaps. Patrick is absolutely right that his organization's plan has bipartisan support, but it also has more support from Democrats than Republicans in the broader public, or in general, Electoral College reform has more support from Democrats rather than Republicans. And there's some reasons for that. And perhaps the biggest is that the Democratic Party is the one that's been stung by the Electoral College more in recent history, with twice in the last 20 years, Democratic presidential candidates winning the popular vote and losing the Electoral College. Well, that'll tend to reinforce more dislike for a particular voting system among one side of the aisle than the other. That said, it seems to me that the most likely way that it gets changed is through the National Interstate Vote Compact. That's an organization and a process, Patrick, that's been really successful getting a large number of states to sign on. And you'd know better than I exactly how many at this point. And that's a far easier approach than the other two ways that you could change the Electoral College system. The other two ways would be one, amending the US Constitution, which we all know is extremely hard, requires a broad level of support at various levels of government. And then two, the other way would be to get Congress to change its certification practices. Congress could unilaterally decide they simply will not certify a winner that won the Electoral College vote, but not the popular vote, and they could change how they count and certify votes at that level. But as we saw on January 6th, the certification of votes in Congress tends to be pretty contentious, and it's unlikely that you would have broad bipartisan support to change something like that. So I'm never quite certain if the change is exactly how likely it is that we'll get to a point of change, because there are some entrenched interests that at least believe they benefit from the Electoral College, whether they do or not. But it seems if there is a path, it's probably through that National Interstate Vote Compact, which seems to have the most momentum behind a real substantive change to the Electoral College.
Thank you, Professor. Peter, you are one of these individuals. Does the Electoral College need reform, in your opinion? Should we change it?
Maybe you can tweak small things about it, but I think overall it doesn't need much reform. And maybe it's because I live in a rural area, and I live in a drive-through county in a flyover state. And I can see that the Electoral College, the way it is, allows us to flex our muscle just a little bit. We don't have a lot to do, but it protects us. We don't want California, New York, Florida, Pennsylvania, Illinois telling Utah how to cast their votes. And so I think the Electoral College protects Utah and the Utahns in expressing their interests to Congress. It also lets us, or forces the presidential candidates to reach out and build a coalition of states and of interests to build that support to get elected, right? If they go to a national popular vote, from what I've seen, they can focus on special interests, even more focused than they are now, and focus their efforts on a handful of states. And that leaves the rest of us out in the cold.
Good points. Very good points. Patrick, I think you're probably the one who's on the clearest pathway of reform. But tell us a little bit about what your thoughts after listening to the professor and to Peter.
Well, sure. Well, first of all, I think it's absolutely a viable solution, and I can get to that in a minute. But the idea that somehow, some way, the current system makes candidates build broad coalitions ignores everything we see anytime there's a presidential campaign. In the 2020 presidential campaign, 96% of the activity of the general election campaign occurred in just 12 states. 33 states were completely ignored during the last presidential election. And the idea that rural voters somehow are protected by the current system, I guess data would point to something very different. The truth is, I think if you add up the population in the top 100 cities, these urban centers, it's 1/6 of the population. If you add up the population in rural America, it's 1/6 of the population. So frankly, the only way I know how to put rural interests at parity with urban interests is by having a national popular vote for president, because if you're a voter in a drive-through county of a flyover state, you're going to matter. That vote is going to offset a vote in Los Angeles, and candidates are going to do a better job of campaigning to your interests, not ignoring them. As to the bipartisan nature of national popular vote, look, I've seen the partisan pendulum swing on this issue 3 times since I started working on it. It usually has to do with who has control of the White House, right?
Sure.
So I will say that, we have 16 jurisdictions, 15 states in the District of Columbia with 196 electoral votes that have passed our bill. I will tell you, we've passed one chamber or another in 9 additional states with 88 electoral votes, more than the 74 required. Some of those chambers have been the Arizona House of Representatives and the Oklahoma Senate. Not a lot of liberals in those chambers. At the end of the day, Republicans, Democrats, and independents who believe that every voter in every state should be relevant when we elect the president are going to get this done. I know we have bills currently pending in 17 states, right? With more than 155 electoral votes. So the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact isn't a theory. It's a political movement that's time has come. And frankly, I can't think of a single redeeming quality to the current system. All of the attributes that people try to give to the current system are actually red herrings, to be honest with you, because small states aren't protected, nor are rural communities. As a matter of fact, we had a lot of Republican support for our bill in Utah, simply because land use policy is totally ignored by American presidents. Guys like Mike Noel, who aren't exactly liberals, were chief authors of our bill in the state of Utah, because they believe that Utah voters should matter in every presidential election. And the current system allows these candidates to ignore the interests of Utahns. And I think that's pretty clear.
Gosh, Patrick, you make some very salient points. I think on those points, and even when I served in the legislature, I remember this came up as well. And we have a very high percentage of federal lands in our state. And that exact argument came up. Professor, does that argument carry weight? Will it carry water? Does that work, what Patrick's talking about?
Yeah, I mean, the abundance of evidence is that you'd actually probably get broader connection between presidential campaigns and a larger share of voters through having a national popular vote than you would through the current system. Now, people have really strong feelings about that, and everything Peter said is incredibly relevant. You need people to actually believe that the system is working for them. And people who live in different situations in this country believe that the Electoral College does or doesn't work for them in different ways. But there's, one stat I always give my students to try to get them to think critically about the Electoral College, which is often my goal, is just like, well, this is something that we should have on the table like anything else for discussion, is that there were more Republican votes and more rural votes in California than the entire Mountain West. And those rural Republican votes in California are essentially locked out of having any influence over the outcome of the system or outcome of the election under the current system. They could be unlocked, as could sort of any minority voters in any state through this. Ultimately, for most political scientists anyway, the thing that's usually most objectionable about the Electoral College is simply that some people's votes count more than others, which is supposed to be against our one person, one vote ethos as a country. If you live in Wyoming, your vote counts 3.5 times as much as if you're a voter in California. And that tends to be where political scientists hold our system up against sort of democratic norms and democratic ideals. We see that as problematic.
This discussion is so enlightening. I think you and Patrick and Peter ought to teach a class together. I think you guys would be pretty dynamic in that. That's pretty good. Thank you to our audience for participating. Our first question, let me just read it to you here. What were slave states' arguments and interests regarding the Electoral College? And Professor, why don't we start with you, and then Peter and Patrick, if you want to weigh in that, if you got that historic. I think that's a really interesting question in the world that we live in today.
It's interesting that the debate over how we would elect the president didn't necessarily break down between slave states and non-slave states so much. A state like Virginia actually was one of the states that was most in favor and most vocally in favor of a direct popular vote. And there was no slave state in the Union in 1787 that was more powerful and advocating in many other ways more so for slave state power than Virginia. But they were also one of the largest states. And so having a directly proportional way of electing the president was seen as advantageous to them. Now, one thing that slave owners in slave dominated states did perhaps like about the Electoral College after the fact is that it baked in the 3/5 compromise, which affected congressional representation generally, into the election of the president, where, for those who are unfamiliar with the 3/5 compromise, it meant that every slave essentially would count as 3/5 of a person, or every 5 slaves would count as 3 people for the purpose of apportioning House seats and then thus Electoral College votes to states that had both free and enslaved people, which meant states like Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia were essentially overrepresented in the House of Representatives because in terms of actual free folks and voters, which meant they were also overrepresented in the Electoral College. But that wasn't necessarily a big part of the debate at the convention, but it did become sort of a benefit that slave states gained through the Electoral College once it was put in place.
Peter, Patrick, any other insight from your perspectives?
Sure. Peter, go ahead if you have some. I do. I would say that, Professor Curry points it out, right? Like the slave compromise was more in Article 1 around representation in Congress, which obviously impacted the number of electors. But I do believe that the slavery issue, sort of as much as any issue, led to the state-based winner-take-all system that we have today. And you talk about Virginia. I think there's a misconception out there that the state-based winner-take-all system was the founder's system. It wasn't at all. In the first 2 presidential elections, all the states went back and adopted various methods. New Jersey had the governor's cabinet appoint. South Carolina had legislative selection of electors. There were presidential elector districts in states like Virginia and New Jersey, Pennsylvania. But interestingly enough, in the first 2 presidential elections, it didn't matter what method you used as a state. I mean, George Washington was the tallest dude of the time, right? He was going to get 100% of the electoral votes. He was the celebrity candidate. In the 3rd presidential election, 2 guys wanted to be president, Jefferson and Adams. the way that John Adams won that third presidential election is that he was able to cherry pick electors out of presidential elector districts in what should have been Jeffersonian states, one of which came out of Virginia. And so what Virginia did, Jefferson tweeted Monroe, who ran the legislature in Virginia in the Capitol, and said, that isn't going to happen again. Virginia, the largest state at the time, moves to the state-based winner-take-all law to ensure that it would consolidate the political power of the political party of the state, which was the Jeffersonian party. And then northern states start responding in kind. And so in the lead up to the Civil War, or the War of Northern Aggression, depending on who you are and where you come from, the North and the South start adopting these state-based winner-take-all laws so they can consolidate the political power and advance the cultural, economic, and political interests of the citizens of their state, which slavery was a big part of. And now it's sort of baked in this battleground state system that we're not stuck with if we want to change it. But I think that's primarily the role that slavery has played in the adoption of the state-based winner-take-all laws.
I think we're creating something here. I think Lin-Manuel Miranda might be interested. Forget Hamilton. Let's do this on the electoral college. And I think we should be the copyright people on that. So Professor, get us in there and let's write this story. We could have Peter in there. Peter, I'm going to ask you this next question that came from some of our students. Let me just make sure I've got it right here. Let's see, where did it go? Sorry about that. I need to just pull it down a little bit. There we go. So I'll start with you, Peter. What is it that you would respond to the idea that direct democracy is mob rule, or that it's two wolves and a sheep deciding what to have for dinner? And I don't know if you raise sheep or cattle or wolves, but I think you might be the right person for that question.
Well, we raise cattle, but we don't have to deal too much with wolves here where I live. Pure democracy can turn into mob rule easily. That's why we've got representative democracy.
Right.
You're there to listen to the people, and those that are elected have to weigh, or should weigh, those interests of the people they represent. However, they're also looking at other issues. How's this going to affect the state? How's it going to affect the nation? And they've got to weigh those interests. When we go to pure democracy, everybody tends to look out for their own self-interests. And that's where it starts to turn into the mob rule. And all too often, the general population doesn't want to delve into, or doesn't delve into, some of these issues in the depth that they require to get the complete understanding. And so, yeah, I believe that representative democracy is a much better way to handle it.
Great. James, Patrick, any comment on that?
All I would say is I agree with Peter. I mean, a pure democracy would be like an Athenian democracy that the founders sort of feared, right? Where we'd all, as citizens, be voting on various issues.
Right.
The truth is we live in a representative democracy, and I think we'd live in a representative democracy under the current system or a national popular vote system. We'd continue to elect presidents for terms who would be our elected representatives. So I agree with Peter.
Professor, anything else?
No, I think Peter and Patrick got it just right.
So I'm going to start with you, Professor, on this next question that came from our audience. And these kids are really smart. 50 Republican senators represent 20 million fewer voters than Democratic senators. What compromise could rebalance this? And in consequence, the Electoral College. So that's a thoughtful question there.
Yeah, I mean, that's due to, as you all know, the fact that
Right.
the Senate has equal representation, 2 senators per state, regardless of population. If you switch to a national popular vote, obviously that would go away in the election of the president. because it would no longer matter where those votes came from. You wouldn't have the apportionment of votes reflecting the bicameral nature of our apportionment at the House and Senate level, which tends to favor smaller states. So you could, switching to a national popular vote would eliminate that from the presidential arena. As far as Congress goes, essentially you'd have to reform the Senate if you wanted to change the way in which some voters have larger voice in the Senate than others.
Yeah. Yeah. Peter or Patrick, anything from your perspective?
The only thing I'd like to add there is that the Senate is the small state protection, not the Electoral College,
yeah,
right? That is the small state protection. So it would require restructuring under Article 1. I'm single subject on the national popular vote, but don't confuse the Electoral College for the small state protection. That's what the United States Senate is for. And I guess I'd personally vigorously oppose that, but that's me.
Okay, well, this is why it's good to have this civil debate, which you all are so good at. And I want to get to all these questions. Here's an interesting question, and Peter, it might resonate with you. In a scenario where the faithless elector would, with life in prison, if they vote for someone else, and it's pretty dramatic, assume the faithless vote are valid, do you think that the faithless elector would do it anyway?
Well, I think that punishment would be pretty draconian. So rather than having faithless electors, you would just have somebody resign rather than face that penalty, and somebody else would be appointed because they don't want to face a penalty so draconian. You need to be able to have faithless electors, I believe. It's a check and balance on the power. Something can happen in the meantime. You need that check and balance there of a faithless elector. So making the penalty so severe would eliminate faithless electors.
Any comment, Professor? I think we're all, I think we're all excellent. Peter, maybe you've got a new calling in life. You'll be teaching up at the university, so.
Well, I'd rather talk to cows than people.
I don't know. Professor, do you have any comment on that? You probably have those days too.
I'll say that our students are wonderful people to talk to.
I think all of you could run for office. So the follow-up question on this, and Professor, I'll go back to you on this. How would that change with a national popular vote? Biden beat Trump in California by 5 million votes, 1 million in New York, 1 million in Illinois, seems to shift from 12 states to most populous states. That's a good point.
I assume that what the question is raising is that, and this is a concern that you hear a lot with potential electoral college reform, that the electoral college ensures that the winning president has to earn a coalition made up of many states, and that in the absence of that, just a small number of states would be able to constitute a majority. And that's something of a myth. I mean, theoretically, if every voter in about 9 states voted for one candidate, they could potentially get to a majority. That seems particularly unlikely because, as we know, even these states that tend to be skewed heavily one way or the other, such as in California, you still had almost 40% of the votes cast for the Republican candidate. And same in New York, same in New Jersey or Illinois. It's not as if every vote in those states is coming from going to a candidate on one side of the aisle, which means that the eventual popular vote winner would have to get support from across all the states, or a large number of them. You wouldn't have necessarily just those, as Patrick pointed out earlier, there aren't enough just urban votes in large states to essentially win the presidency. You would still need suburban votes and some rural votes to put it together. So it's one of those things that you hear a lot, but the math doesn't work out. You really couldn't win the presidency and run the country just by winning urban areas and just by winning a small number of large states.
Patrick, Peter, any other insight on that?
Well, I would just say data is compelling. I think everybody, it's a good little soundbite, California, New York, boo.
Right.
Right. And I think you got to scratch the surface a little bit and, do the research. California and New York, 18% of the vote and shrinking in the country. Texas and Florida, 15% of the vote and growing. Right. So for every California and New York, you got a Texas and Florida. And I think we know that when you run in first past the post systems, right? This is a political science class. Candidate with the most votes wins.
Right.
In a single member district, meaning the United States of America. That's like running for governor in Utah.
Right.
Whoever gets the most votes for governor in Utah is elected president. And I'm guessing Peter doesn't have to pay for his lawn sign in his drive-through part of a flyover state when electing a governor. As a matter of fact, a governor makes sure that everybody in that county turns out if they can count on his support, right? So we know that when you matter, when every voter in every state or every voter in the state of Utah is equal in terms of having an impact on the outcome in a close election, they don't get ignored. That's not true under the current system we use. So the only way to make every voter in every state politically relevant in every presidential election is to make sure that the candidate with the most votes in all 50 states and the District of Columbia is elected. And then I don't care where you live. If it's Bismarck, North Dakota, or Boca Raton, Florida, I'm going after your votes. And I say that as a guy who used to be pretty senior at the campaign level, who used to routinely ignore people because he knew they didn't matter to the outcome. As a matter of fact, when President Bush was running for re-election, we didn't even poll in 32 states.
Right.
And Utah was one of them. You know why?
Right.
Because we knew Utah were going to get their electoral votes before we even knew who the candidates were.
Right.
And at the end of the day, I don't think a rancher in Utah should be ignored when electing the president of the United States. So
good point. Really good point. Well, Patrick, I'm going to keep you on the spot. This next question, I think probably would be right up your alley. Can you please address the idea that the Electoral College favors Republicans and a NPV would favor Democrats? I think that's where it goes.
Look, I think a national popular vote for president is going to favor the candidate who's got the message of most resonance to the most American voters, right? And I think at times that's Republicans and at times that's Democrats. I really don't believe, frankly, if you look at it structurally, if you go do some research on the blue wall, I think I could make a compelling case that the current system favors the Democratic candidate for president, right? Now, I could also say that Donald Trump, frankly, in the last two presidential elections, the only place he campaigned was the battleground states. And he won the most popular votes in the battleground states. You know why? Because he campaigned to every voter in those battleground states. Now, I think what I know for sure is that if you have a national popular vote for president, where every voter in every state is politically relevant, the candidate with the ideas that resonate most with the most American voters, rural, urban, suburban, is going to be elected president of the United States. And just because Hillary Clinton won the popular vote and lost the presidential election doesn't mean she would have won a national popular vote election. In NASCAR, you drive to the points, right? Donald Trump campaigned in 5 Rust Belt states that elected him president of the United States and didn't get distracted by what California was doing or not doing, right? Or at the end of the day, in a national popular vote system, he would have had to campaign to all corners of this country, and she would have had to do the same, and whoever won the most votes would have been elected president, but that result would be very different if it was run under a national popular vote system. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it does. And Professor, I saw you nodding there, and I think we're all in the same position on that. We have about 10 minutes left, and I want to make sure that we get all the questions. So maybe we could go a little rapid fire here. And I'd like to hear from all 3 of you on this question. What kind of pushback do you think there will be if there is a reform to the electoral system? Will it be more threats? Peter, I hope not. But Peter, or let's start with you, and then James, and then what kind of pushback will there be?
I can't speak for everywhere, but for my area, there would be pushback. You talk about how if you've got a popular vote, they're not going to neglect us. Yet in the state of Utah, candidates often neglect us because we're not important. We don't have enough votes to make a difference. So they center the stuff there. So in places like this, there's going to be pushback. Other places will just embrace it. They'll say, this is great. it'll give us more of a say. But places like where I live, where we are ignored, even for US Senate races, governor's race, people don't like this. They see the Electoral College as a protection for us and our voice.
Good. Professor, anything else?
Yeah, I mean, that's generally the case. That any reform that where people see it as being a net negative for them, you're going to have opposition, and places where see it as a net positive are going to embrace it. That's why to pull off this kind of reform, and I think this fits well with the way that the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact has approached things by going state to state and trying to win over lawmakers in those states, is you got to persuade people that this is in their interests. And if you can do that, if you can win them over, then if you can bring them into the tent and make them believe that this is a reform, this is a change that would be good on the whole, both individually and collectively, then you can get people to buy in without there being substantial pushback, without there being protests or revolts. If you try to do it without that sort of coalition building, without that persuasion, then you're going to have a more contentious future as a result. Not that our present situation isn't contentious in its own right.
But well, and to the audience out there, to the students, what you just heard is really at the heart and soul of good policymaking. You need to build that coalition, whether it's in your own party or whether it's across the aisle, in order to make things work. And that's the point about creating win-wins, so people can feel comfortable that the proposal and policy initiative is one that will benefit them, essentially what it is. Patrick, did you have anything else on that? Because I've got another question.
Yeah, look, the burden of proof is on the proponents of change, and change is often scary. But the truth is the current system is crushing under its own weight, and the idea that it lends itself to stability ignores the idea that too many American voters feel like they're not valued in the process, which leads to a system where we're boarding up cities before presidential elections based on one side not liking a result.
Right.
And then we have the other side charging the United States Capitol when they didn't like the result. So I think if we're all valued, we'd probably do a better job of living with the result. And I can't think of any way to reinvigorate rural counties and political parties that would make a more meaningful difference than a national popular vote for president. Because on the Republican side, I need every rural voter I can get to win a national popular vote for president. And I just say, Peter, a national popular vote, you will not be ignored. I think you are under the current system.
Good. Again, I want to get all these questions. So, and let's start with you, Patrick, on this. Why do most states utilize the popular vote for primaries and not electoral vote? Are there any points of debate on the voting process for primaries? Good question.
Well, I mean, both systems use a popular vote, right? That's where this mob rule thing gets kind of fun, right? Under the current system, all 50 states have given their people the right to vote for president. That does not exist in the Constitution. So we do have the mob ruling on a state by state basis, right? If you believe that's mob rule, meaning popular election of a president.
Right.
So at the end of the day, we have a popular vote for president in the primaries because the states have given the people the power to vote for president. We have a popular vote for president on a state by state basis or a congressional district basis in 2 states, because the state has given the people the power to vote for president. So you have popular votes for president already. Now it's about having a national popular vote.
Professor?
Something I will add in just on this to provide some context is that I think most people don't realize that we don't actually have a direct one person, one vote, popular vote for presidential nominations contests either. Within each state you vote, and the person who gets the most votes wins the delegates in some proportional way. But the number of delegates handed out from state to state is done through a relatively complicated formula on each side of the aisle, where states that tend to have more Democratic voters tend to get more votes at the convention. There's other ways you can get more votes at the convention for your state. And so it gets skewed in a somewhat similar way, though, for completely different reasons and by completely different purposes. And so for people who don't like the Electoral College system because it's not a one person, one vote, they should also consider the way that the nominations contests sort of skew the one person, one vote within both parties. And those choices have huge implications for who wins. If you go back to, for instance, the 2008 Democratic nomination contest, Hillary Clinton won more overall votes in the Democratic primaries and caucuses than Barack Obama. But because of the way those votes are reallocated into delegates at the national convention, Barack Obama became the Democratic nominee and ultimately the president, and Hillary Clinton didn't. So there's a whole lot of ways that we sort of skew votes as we get from point one in the presidential contest to January 20th and someone's inaugurated.
Peter, anything on that subject? Okay, let's go to the next question. Oh, go ahead. Sorry, Peter.
Sorry. I was just going to back up what Professor Curry said. You know, we've got it's not always a primary. Different states handle it differently. You've got the caucuses. Sometimes it's the state central committee. And then once again, he brought up the national conventions. And each party does it differently. I know the Republican Party gives each congressional district at least 3 national delegates, whether they are a democratically held or a republicanly held district. And so it skews it that way a little bit too, trying to build a coalition of people to select their nominee.
Thank you. And this next question, if everyone could just take about 20 seconds because we're pushing up against the clock. Given the U.S. population changes between states, should the distribution of electors among states be reevaluated more often than once every 10 years? Follow up to that, how serious might a legal to NPV interstate compact be? So how serious might the legal charge of NPV interstate compact be, and should it be evaluated more than every 10 years? Patrick, do you want to go first?
Well, I'll take on the second question because the first question, I mean, like the total number of representatives in Congress is determined by the census, which is defined as every 10 years.
Right.
The second piece is, look, this is America. There will be lawsuits, right? Every American citizen will have a standing to sue. The court has never been more clear that Article 2, Section 1 is a plenary power of the state legislature to award electors. I don't think there'll be any real legal challenge on that. That won't be summarily dismissed. Article 1, Section 10 allows states to form agreements amongst themselves called compacts. The only legal question will be, does this compact require congressional consent? And we could do a whole Zoom call on that.
Okay. Peter, 10 seconds, if you have a comment.
I don't think the court gives broad deference to states on how they bind their electors. And so I don't know how serious a legal challenge would be.
Okay, Professor? Okay, I'm going to ask this question to each of you. This is a great question to end on. Do you think national popular vote system would dramatically increase voter turnout? Let's go with you, Peter, first.
I don't think it would dramatically increase turnout. I think the people that participate now, a lot of them don't understand the electoral system anyway, and they think they've got that. It's not going to get more people participating.
Great. Professor?
Dramatic is hard to say. It's in all likelihood likely to affect turnouts in different places. We know that people turn out more often if they feel like the contest is more personal to them, or if they feel like they have a greater likelihood of having an impact in the outcome. And we've seen that states that are uncompetitive in the Electoral College for really long periods of time tend to have lower turnout. But then again, on the other hand, we just saw the highest turnout in American presidential race in over 100 years in 2020, in a race that was less competitive than 2016 in a lot of ways. And so it's always hard to say that it would have a dramatic, systematic effect, but it might affect turnout in places that have been uncompetitive in the presidential election for a long time.
Patrick, 10 seconds.
I think it's the principal reason to support a national popular vote. We know that turnout in 2016 was 11 points higher in battleground states than flyover states. We know it was 16 points higher in 2012 in battleground states than flyover states. And we know it was higher by 9% in 2008 in battleground states and flyover states. If you want to increase participation, make voters be valued, and national popular vote will do more to reinvigorate the body politic than any reform in a very long time.
Great way to end this segment. Listen, thank you to Peter. Thank you to James. Thank you to Patrick. I want to thank Molly Wheeler in putting this together, and Lopez. On behalf of the Hinckley Institute program, What a pleasure it has been to be with all of you. And I can tell you one thing, today was edifying for everyone, and we all should participate in the process and never be afraid. You can hear us on KCPW, and we appreciate their support. And thank you to everyone. Hope you have a great day. And don't forget to vote and run for an elector. Might be a little challenging, but run for one. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.